There is a hill in northern Switzerland, in the canton of Aargau, where a small castle sits among the trees. It is not grand, it is not famous. Most travelers driving between Zurich and Basel pass within 15 kilometers of it and never know it exists. The parking lot holds maybe 20 cars. There is no gift shop worth mentioning. And yet, the family that built this castle would go on to rule the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, the Netherlands, Hungary, Bohemia, large stretches of Italy, and much of the Americas. They would sit on thrones across 3 continents for over 600 years. They would produce emperors, kings, queens, archdukes, and cardinals in numbers that no other family in European history has ever matched. The castle is called Habsburg, and the family took its name. It was built around 1020 by a local count named Radbot, a minor nobleman in the Duchy of Swabia. Radbot was not powerful, he was not famous. His county of Klettgau was small, his ambitions were local, and history barely remembers him at all. The Habsburgs at this point were one of dozens of similar families scattered across the sprawling, loosely connected collection of German-speaking territories that was, as the old joke goes, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire.
For over 2 centuries, the Habsburgs remained exactly what they started as, minor regional lords. They accumulated some lands, they made some useful alliances, they built a second castle. None of this was remarkable. In an empire filled with ambitious families, the Wittelsbachs, the Welfs, the Hohenstaufen, the Habsburgs were background noise. Then, in 1273, something unexpected happened. The Holy Roman Empire had been without a proper ruler for nearly 20 years, a chaotic stretch known as the Great Interregnum. The 7 powerful prince-electors who chose the emperor finally gathered in Frankfurt to end the deadlock. They needed a king, but none of them wanted to elect someone too strong, someone who might actually threaten their own power. So they chose Rudolf of Habsburg. He was, by design, a compromise candidate, a man powerful enough to be credible, but not powerful enough to be dangerous. The prince-electors assumed they could control him. They were wrong. Rudolf proved far shrewder than anyone expected. He defeated his chief rival, King Ottokar II of Bohemia, at the Battle on the Marchfield in 1278 and seized Austria and Styria for his family. This was the decisive move. Austria would become the Habsburgs' permanent base, the land they would hold for the next 640 years, long after they lost the little castle in Switzerland. But Rudolf also established something more important than territory. He established a method. The Habsburgs learned earlier than most that there was a cheaper and more reliable way to gain power than war: marriage. To understand what the Habsburgs did, you first have to understand what marriage meant in medieval and early modern Europe. It had almost nothing to do with love. A royal marriage was a contract, a merger of assets, drafted by diplomats, blessed by priests, and sealed with children. The bride's dowry was land, the groom's offer was protection, and the fine print was inheritance law. If a ruling family had no male heir, the throne could pass through a daughter to her husband's family. If a dynasty died out entirely, the last surviving marriage connection determined who inherited the crown. This meant that a single well-placed wedding could, decades later, deliver an entire kingdom into your hands without a single soldier crossing a single border. Every royal family in Europe understood this.
The difference was that most families treated marriage as one tool among many, alongside warfare, diplomacy, and the occasional assassination. The Habsburgs made it their primary instrument. They pursued it with a patience and a precision that bordered on obsession. Where other dynasties gambled on battles, the Habsburgs gambled on bloodlines, and they were remarkably good at it. The man who turned this instinct into a system was Maximilian I. Maximilian was born in 1459, the son of Emperor Frederick III, a Habsburg ruler so cautious and passive that his own subjects mocked him. Frederick spent most of his reign avoiding conflict, hoarding money, and doodling a mysterious acronym in the margins of his notebooks, AEIOU. No one knew exactly what it meant, but the most popular interpretation was Austriae est imperare orbi universo. It is Austria's destiny to rule the world. Frederick's ambitions outstripped his abilities, but his son would make those ambitions real. In 1477, when Maximilian was just 18 years old, he married Mary of Burgundy. This was one of the most consequential weddings in European history. Mary was the sole heir of the Burgundian state, a dazzling collection of territories that included modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and large parts of eastern France. The Burgundian court was the richest in Europe. Its cities, Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, were centers of trade, banking, and art. Burgundian tapestries hung in palaces from London to Rome. Burgundian fashions set the standard for aristocratic taste across the continent. To inherit Burgundy was to inherit not just land, but wealth and prestige on a scale that few kingdoms could match. And now, through a single marriage, all of it belonged to the Habsburgs. There was a war, of course. The French king, Louis XI, tried to seize the Burgundian inheritance by force, but Maximilian fought him off, and the bulk of the territories stayed in Habsburg hands. Mary died young in 1482 after falling from a horse while hunting. She was only 25. By all accounts, Maximilian was genuinely devastated. Theirs had been one of the rare royal marriages that contained real affection. But grief did not slow the machine. The inheritance was secure, and Maximilian was already planning the next move. He now turned his attention to the next generation. His son, Philip, was called Philip the Handsome, and Maximilian arranged for him to marry Juana of Castile, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. At the same time, Maximilian married his daughter Margaret to Juana's brother, Prince Juan. This was a classic Habsburg double marriage. 2 weddings, 2 alliances, every angle covered. Prince Juan died young. So did several other heirs ahead of Juana in the Spanish line of succession. One by one, the obstacles between the Habsburgs and the Spanish crown disappeared, not through conspiracy, but through the simple brutality of medieval mortality. By the early 1500s, it became clear that Philip and Juana's children would inherit not only Austria and Burgundy, but also Spain, its Italian possessions, and the rapidly expanding territories of the New World. A Latin phrase began to circulate in the courts of Europe, half admiring and half afraid. Bella gerant ali, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry. The product of all these marriages arrived in the year 1500. His name was Charles. He was the son
of Philip the Handsome and Juana of Castile, the grandson of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy on one side, and Ferdinand and Isabella on the other. By the time he was 19 years old, he held more titles than any ruler in European history. He was King of Spain, King of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Burgundy, Lord of the Netherlands, Archduke of Austria, and in 1519, at the age of 19, he was elected Holy Roman Emperor, becoming Charles V. His empire stretched from Vienna to Peru, from the Philippines to the Low Countries. It was said that in his domains the sun never set. This was not a metaphor, it was a geographical fact. At any given moment, somewhere in the territory ruled by Charles V, it was daylight. No single person had ever controlled this much of the Earth's surface, and no single person ever would again. But size was not the same as strength. Charles inherited an empire that was impossibly vast and impossibly fragmented. Each territory had its own laws, its own language, its own parliament, its own grievances. The Spanish resented being ruled by a man who had grown up in Flanders and barely spoke Castilian. The Germans resented paying taxes to fund wars in Italy. The Dutch resented everyone. And then there were the external threats. France, nearly encircled by Habsburg territory, fought Charles relentlessly, 4 major wars in 3 decades. The Ottoman Empire, under Suleiman the Magnificent, pushed deep into Central Europe, destroying the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526. The young Hungarian king, Louis II, drowned fleeing the battlefield. His horse stumbled into a swollen stream, and the weight of his armor pulled him under. He was 20 years old. Hungary was shattered, and the Ottomans advanced to the walls of Vienna itself in 1529. The siege failed, but only barely, and the Ottoman threat would hang over Habsburg lands for the next 2 centuries.
Inside the empire, a German monk named Martin Luther had launched a religious revolution that was tearing the social fabric of Europe apart. Princes who converted to Protestantism seized church lands and defied imperial authority. Charles tried negotiation. He tried coercion. He tried war. None of it worked permanently. Charles spent his entire adult life moving from crisis to crisis, riding from one end of his empire to the other. He crossed the English Channel 9 times, traveled to Italy 7 times, visited Germany 9 times, went to Spain 6 times, sailed to North Africa twice. He fought in person. He negotiated in person. He governed in person. And slowly, it broke him. By his mid-50s, Charles was exhausted. He suffered from crippling gout, his joints swollen, his hands barely able to hold a pen. He had grown old before his time, and he had come to a conclusion that no ruler of his stature had ever reached before. He decided to quit.
On October 25, 1555, in the great hall of the palace at Brussels, Charles V stood before the assembled nobles of the Netherlands. He was 55 years old and looked far older. He needed help walking, and he leaned on the shoulder of a young nobleman, William of Orange, who would later lead a revolt against Charles's own son. Charles spoke slowly. He listed his travels, his wars, his burdens. He told the assembled lords that his powers no longer sufficed. He asked for their forgiveness for any mistakes he had made. And then, weeping, he abdicated. He gave Spain, the Netherlands, Italy, and the Americas to his son, Philip II. He gave Austria, Bohemia,
Hungary, and the imperial title to his brother, Ferdinand. The single largest empire in European history was split into two halves, the Spanish Habsburgs and the Austrian Habsburgs. Charles retired to a monastery in Spain. He spent his final years eating, praying, and tinkering with clocks. He died in 1558, largely forgotten by the courts that had once trembled at his name. The empire had been divided, but the family remained one. And to keep it that way, the two branches of the Habsburgs began a practice that would define their dynasty and ultimately destroy it. They began to marry each other.
The logic was simple. If the Habsburgs had built their empire through marriage, then marriage was also how they could lose it. Every daughter married to an outside family was a potential claim lost. Every son who wed a foreign princess was a door opened for outsiders to inherit Habsburg lands. The solution was obvious, at least to the diplomats and dynasts who arranged these things. Marry within the family, Habsburg to Habsburg, Spanish cousin to Austrian cousin, uncle to niece, and in several cases, much closer than that. This was not unusual for European royalty. Cousin marriages were common across the continent's ruling families, but no dynasty practiced it with the consistency, the intensity, and the sheer repetition that the Habsburgs did. Over the 2 centuries following Charles V's abdication, the Spanish and Austrian branches intermarried so frequently that the family tree stopped looking like a tree at all. It folded in on itself, the same names appearing again and again, lines crossing and recrossing until the diagram resembled something closer to a web or a knot. Consider just the Spanish line. Philip II married his first cousin, Anna of Austria. Their son, Philip III, married his second cousin, Margaret of Austria. Philip III's son, Philip IV, married his niece, Mariana of Austria, who was also his first cousin once removed through another line. And Mariana and Philip's son, Carlos II, was the product of so many overlapping unions that, genetically speaking, his parents were closer than an average uncle and niece. Modern geneticists who have reconstructed the Habsburg family tree estimate that Carlos II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254. To put that number in perspective, the expected coefficient for a child born to a brother and sister is 0.250. Carlos II was, by this measure, more inbred than the offspring of siblings. The effects became visible long before Carlos. Portrait after portrait of Habsburg rulers shows a distinctive facial feature growing more pronounced with each generation: a protruding lower jaw, an extended chin, an underbite so severe that in some cases the teeth could not meet. Historians call it the Habsburg jaw. Geneticists call it mandibular prognathism. A 2019 study published in the Annals of Human Biology examined 15 members of the dynasty across 9 generations and found a direct correlation between the degree of inbreeding and the severity of the jaw deformity. You can trace it yourself if you line up the portraits chronologically. Maximilian I, in the late 1400s, has a noticeable but manageable underbite. Charles V, 2 generations later, had a jaw so pronounced that he reportedly struggled to close his mouth fully and had difficulty chewing. By the time you reach Philip IV in the mid-1600s, the jaw has become almost a caricature of itself. and the court painters, constrained by the need to flatter their patron, were clearly softening what they saw. But the jaw was only the most visible symptom. Behind the portraits, the medical records, scattered and incomplete as they are, paint a grimmer picture. Infant mortality in the Spanish Habsburg line was staggeringly high. Between 1527 and 1661, the Spanish Habsburgs produced 34 children. Of those, 10 died before their first birthday. That is a rate of roughly 29%, far higher than the already brutal average of the period, and dramatically higher than comparable royal families. The surviving children were often sickly, slow to develop, and plagued by ailments that their physicians could not explain: epilepsy, gout at young ages, intellectual disabilities, infertility. A strategy that had built the largest empire in European history was now, generation by generation, poisoning the bloodline of the family that created it. The Habsburgs had discovered something that genetics would not formally describe for another 300 years: that the relentless concentration of the same genes passed back and forth within a closed group does not preserve strength, it destroys it. And nowhere would this destruction be more complete or more tragic than in the body of the last Spanish Habsburg king. Carlos II of Spain was born on November 6, 1661, in the Royal Alcazar of Madrid. He was the only surviving son of King Philip IV and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. The court rejoiced at his birth. Spain needed an heir. The dynasty needed continuity. The empire needed a king. What they got was a child who could barely survive. Carlos did not walk until he was 4 years old. He did not speak clearly until he was 8. His head was disproportionately large for his body. His tongue was so swollen that he had difficulty chewing food and was often difficult to understand when he spoke. His lower jaw jutted forward so severely that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. The Habsburg jaw carried to its most extreme expression. He drooled constantly. He suffered from chronic intestinal problems, episodes that his doctors recorded but could not treat. He became king at the age of 3 when his father died in 1665. His mother, Mariana, served as regent, and she would remain the dominant force at court for years, reluctant to release power to a son she knew was not capable of wielding it. The court physicians examined him regularly and recorded their observations with a mixture of clinical detachment and barely concealed alarm. He was thin, he was weak, he was frequently ill. He showed little interest in learning, and what education he received produced limited results. Foreign ambassadors stationed in Madrid sent reports home describing a king who seemed, in the words of one French diplomat, like a man always on the verge of death. As Carlos grew older, the problems deepened. He suffered from what contemporary sources describe as fits, likely epileptic seizures. His body aged far faster than it should have. By his 30s, he looked like an old man, gaunt, bald, hollow-eyed, trembling. He could barely walk without assistance. His courtiers had to manage the daily business of governing almost entirely without him, navigating the complex bureaucracy of the Spanish Empire, while their king sat in darkened rooms attended by physicians who could offer nothing but prayer and bloodletting. He was married twice. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was a French princess who reportedly wept when she learned of the engagement. She arrived in Madrid at 17 and found a husband who could barely hold a conversation. She spent 11 years at the Spanish court, produced no children, and died in 1689 at the age of 26, possibly of appendicitis, possibly of something worse. The court mourned, but not for long. A new bride was needed. The dynasty required an heir. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was chosen specifically for her family's reputation for fertility. Her mother had borne 23 children. It did not help. 10 years of marriage produced no heir. The problem, physicians and courtiers whispered, lay with the king. Modern researchers believe Carlos was almost certainly infertile, likely as a result of the accumulated genetic damage of generations. The Spanish court, unable to explain the king's condition through medicine, turned to another explanation. They concluded that Carlos was hechizado, bewitched, cursed by dark forces. Someone or something had placed a hex on the King of Spain, and that was why his body failed, why his mind wandered, why no heir came.
In 1698, the royal court authorized a formal exorcism. A priest named Froilan Diaz, who served as the royal confessor, brought in an exorcist to drive out the demons that were believed to inhabit the king's body. The ritual was performed in the dim chambers of the royal palace. Prayers, incantations, holy water, the full apparatus of 17th century spiritual warfare. Carlos reportedly submitted to the process willingly, perhaps even hopefully. It did not work. The demons were not supernatural. They were genetic. Carlos II died on November 1st, 1700, 5 days before his 39th birthday. He had no children. He had no siblings. He was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. The autopsy was performed shortly after his death. The physician who conducted it, or rather who directed the barber surgeon who performed the physical work, left a report that has haunted historians ever since. According to the account, the king's body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water.
Modern medicine cannot take these descriptions entirely at face value. The clinical gaze of a late 17th century physician was operating under fundamentally different assumptions about what disease was and how it manifested in the body. Organs were not yet understood as sites where specific diseases could be localized. The language of autopsy reports from this period was shaped by humoral theory, by expectation, and, in this case, by the belief that the king had been literally cursed. A heart described as the size of a peppercorn was not necessarily a heart that was literally that small. It was a heart interpreted through a medical framework that saw disease as a total imbalance rather than a localized pathology. But beneath the Baroque language, there is a body, and modern researchers, working backward from the family pedigree, the portraits, and the surviving medical records, have attempted to reconstruct what was actually wrong with Carlos. The possibilities include combined pituitary hormone deficiency, distal renal tubular acidosis, and potentially a rare condition called aspartyl glucosaminuria. His famous jaw was the most visible expression of generations of mandibular prognathism, amplified by each successive round of inbreeding.
What is certain is this: the dynasty that had conquered the world through the marriage bed had finally been consumed by it. The very strategy that built the empire, keeping the bloodline pure, keeping the inheritance within the family, had produced a king who could not eat, could not think clearly, could not produce an heir, and could not survive. Carlos II had no children to inherit. In his will, written in the final weeks of his life, he named Philip of Anjou, a grandson of the French king Louis XIV, as his successor. This decision triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a continent-wide conflict that lasted 13 years and drew in nearly every major power in Europe. When the war was finally over, a Bourbon sat on the Spanish throne. The Habsburgs were gone from Spain forever. The marriage machine had run its last cycle.
The Spanish branch was dead, but the Austrian Habsburgs endured. They would continue to rule from Vienna for another 2 centuries, reshaping themselves again and again to survive the shifting currents of European politics. Maria Theresa, arguably the greatest Habsburg ruler since Charles V, fought off half of Europe to keep her inheritance in the 1740s, when Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded her territory within weeks of her accession, betting that a young woman could not hold a fractured empire together. She proved him wrong. Over a reign of 4 decades, she modernized the empire's administration, introduced compulsory schooling, reformed the tax system, and built an army that could stand against any power on the continent. Her descendants navigated the Napoleonic Wars, absorbed the shock of the 1848 revolutions, and in 1867 struck a grand compromise with Hungary, creating the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, a sprawling multi-ethnic state that stretched from the Alps to the Carpathians, from the Adriatic to the borders of Russia.
But the old contradictions never fully resolved. Austria-Hungary contained Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, Croats, Serbs, Slovenes, Italians, and Bosniaks, each with their own language, their own grievances, their own national aspirations. The empire held together through bureaucracy, tradition, and the personal authority of the emperor. When that authority faltered, nothing could replace it. The end came in 1918 in the wreckage of the First World War. Austria-Hungary had entered the conflict as one of Europe's great powers. It exited as a corpse. The empire dissolved along ethnic lines, splitting into the new nations of Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which would later become Yugoslavia. The last Habsburg emperor, Karl I, was 29 years old when the empire collapsed around him. He never formally abdicated, he merely stepped back from the affairs of state, a careful legal phrasing that preserved, in theory, the family's claim to the throne. It did not matter. He was exiled to Switzerland, attempted 2 failed restorations in Hungary in 1921, and was finally banished to the island of Madeira off the coast of Portugal, where he died of pneumonia in 1922. He was 34 years old. His wife, Empress Zita, dressed in black for the rest of her life. She did not die until 1989, the same year the Berlin Wall fell.
600 years of continuous rule ended in a rented villa on a subtropical island. Today, the Habsburgs are private citizens. The family still exists. There are hundreds of them scattered across Europe and the Americas, working as business people, diplomats, academics, and television presenters. The Habsburg law, passed by the Austrian Republic in 1919, confiscated the family's property and banned them from Austrian soil unless they renounced all claims to the throne. Most eventually did. But their legacy is everywhere. The borders of modern Europe, the shapes of Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic,
Belgium were drawn in large part by Habsburg marriages, Habsburg wars, and Habsburg collapses. The cultural landscape of Central Europe, the Baroque churches, the coffee houses, the opera traditions, the bureaucratic temperament is a Habsburg inheritance. The European Union itself, with its attempt to bind together dozens of nations and languages into a single cooperative framework, is in some ways solving the same problem the Habsburgs spent centuries trying to manage. How do you hold together a continent that does not naturally want to be held together?
And in Aargau, on a quiet hill in northern Switzerland, the castle still stands. It is small. It is modest. It is the kind of place you could walk past without a second glance. There is a view from the tower, green fields, distant mountains, the hum of a country that long ago stopped being part of the empire that was born here. The Habsburgs did not conquer Europe with armies. They conquered it with wedding rings. And the same bloodline that carried them to the summit of the world carried them, in the end, to ruin. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was the most brilliant strategy in European history. It was also the most fatal.